Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. No, I'm not back from vacation. I pre-taped this. Thanks to Kurt Schlichter for sitting in for me all week. I'll be back on Monday. Dr. Arnn was gone the last 2 weeks as well, but he sent in as his reserve quarterback, Khalil Habib. Dr. Habib has been a guest on the show before, and we may overthrow Dr. Arnn and just keep bringing him back so he can teach us all Shakespeare, since none of us can remember it. By the way, Dr. Habib, how many of your students arrive fluent in Shakespeare?
I have to tell you, quite a lot. I was surprised. I didn't know if anyone would even take this course. I'm currently teaching Shakespeare's Henry VI plays and Montesquieu, and it was oversubscribed. I had to lift the cap on the course, and there was still a waiting list. And Shakespeare is beloved on our campus. Students absolutely love him, but no one's read the Henry VI plays, which didn't surprise me because for whatever reason, they're ignored. They're overshadowed by Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. But this is the first time they're coming into contact with Henry VI, but they seem to be enjoying it.
And they can be very overshadowed by Richard III, which we're going to get to today because he's such a great villain. And villains are always more interesting than out of place, misaligned was your word last week, monarchs like Henry VI. But before we move to Richard III, a bottom line takeaway from Montesquieu on Henry VI. What is it?
He doesn't discuss Henry VI specifically, but in Book 11 of The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu holds up the English Constitution as an exemplar of what true political liberty consists of. And he believes that England, and this is his quote, not mine, ultimately developed into a republic hidden inside of a monarchy. And struck by that, and that's what made me turn to these specific plays, because I just had a hunch that Montesquieu was deriving this reading from Shakespeare, and we know he read Shakespeare because he mentions him and he praises him in his My Thoughts, which Liberty Fund just recently published. And when you read them in tandem, when you read them together, it's clear that Shakespeare is, in fact, tracing the emergence of a republican spirit within England. And it really does begin in these English history plays. And as the Plantagenets are escorted out the door, you see the rise of something like a modern state. And sort of you're moved away from the idea that monarchy is necessarily best. And you start to see the importance of the decentralized notion of England and how it did have eventually a system of checks and balances. No. And so Montesquieu, as a Frenchman, I mean, you would think he would be praising the French, and he doesn't. He was hoping the French could learn something from England. And what he saw in England was the rise eventually of an independent judicial system or judiciary, the separation of powers, and the idea that liberty isn't something you just simply write down. Liberty, as Montesquieu describes it, is the opinion of one's security that nobody has to fear the arbitrary harm from a fellow, whether it's from a ruler, a representative, or a fellow citizen. And that necessarily requires the separation of powers. And that's, of course, a nice bridge to the American founding. So that's why I turn to these specific plays.
And I want the Steelers fans to know the Plantagenets are a family of monarchs that go back. Is Henry II the first one?
No, King John.
King John.
So yeah, that's the play. That's the play immediately before. And King John is the first presentation of a Plantagenet king, and they were a warrior family. If you read just history books about them, they were considered quite often the bloodiest royal family the English ever had, and they do have roots from Normandy.
So they run from John to Richard III. Along the way is Henry II, who's a great lawgiver, advised by my patron saint. That's why I know about him, St. Hugh of Lincoln. But he's a lawgiver. And they are up and they're down. Henry V is the warrior. Henry VI we talked about last week. But they end in a rather brief reign of Richard III. Now, I had the great good fortune of hearing a wonderful Shakespearean actor recite Richard III's great monologues at 34,000 feet in the air in the middle of the night. And I thought to myself, my gosh, to be a Shakespearean trained actor is to really, but he could have done anything. He chose Richard III. Why do you think he chose Richard III?
Richard III is the only play in all of Shakespeare that actually begins with a soliloquy. And it's a play in which you find a lot of soliloquies. And there's a simple reason why. He's the only character in all of Shakespeare's work who identifies himself as Machiavelli. So it's not a Straussian reading to say this is a critique of Machiavelli. Shakespeare goes out of his way to show you that. And Machiavelli always says, as you know, that to be a founder, one has to found alone. And so that play begins with somebody who wishes to found alone. And he has a soliloquy that draws you in and really reminds you of Machiavelli's political principles and ideas. So as an actor, I can imagine it would be very tempting to want to play that role because you don't have a prop on stage. It's just you and your ability to convey these ideas convincingly just on stage. I saw Kevin Spacey in London play Richard III years ago, and he was incredible. And I could see why he would be the gold standard for actors. You don't have another person to play off.
This was John Voight. And his audience was right? Dennis Prager, myself, Michael Medved, and some Salem executives on a bumpy flight. And just to get people's minds off of it, he stood up and started doing Richard III, and we are all kind of amazed. I guess Shakespearean trained actors don't ever forget, do they?
No, they don't. I can't imagine. Yeah.
So let's talk about Richard III. Give us the outline of the play, and then let's tell us how. Are you teaching him with Montesquieu as well?
I'm not, but I just finished rereading him literally last week, so it's perfect timing. And I would have added that play, but I was really afraid that I was just going to end. I was going to run out of time. But Richard III is crucial because it is connected to, unfortunately, the failures of Henry VI. Henry VI just couldn't put his foot down. He had struggled to punish criminals. He was terrified of the factions that were destroying England, and he just couldn't put them down. His father would have had no problem. And in fact, if his father was alive, these factions would have been checked and would have been kept at bay. So Richard III, I hate to say it because I do like Henry as a character, in spite of his failures, is the direct result of Henry VI's failures. And so what he ends up doing is Richard does have his family anyway has a legitimate claim to the throne. Henry VI didn't, and neither did Henry V, because their father usurped from the Yorkist line. So Richard III does have a legitimate claim, and this is actually a continuation of Shakespeare's critique of hereditary monarchy. So we know Henry VI was misaligned and he was illegitimate, but now you have a legitimate. And he's completely misaligned with everybody. He is the devil incarnate, and he relishes that role. So you can have a legitimate king. You can have a legitimate claim to the throne. You can have all of the virtues he lacked that Henry VI lacks. Richard III is courageous. He's a warrior. But he also is misaligned because he doesn't have the genuine concern with the common good. He kills for the sake of killing. He loves it, and he relishes in it, and he loves to exploit Christians for sheer personal delight. And so by the time you're done with these plays, you've seen it all.
Does he kill Henry VI or just the boys?
No, he does. In Henry VI Part 3, he does kill Henry VI.
Okay, I'm not losing my mind. But he does kill the princes in the tower, right?
Does. He kills his own brothers. There's a suggestion that he actually killed his brother Edward, who was on the throne, perhaps had him poisoned. He killed the twins. He killed his brother Clarence, who toward the end of his life was beginning to repent and come around. And he even has these dreams where his conscience resurfaces, and he wants to atone for his sins. This is before he even knows his brother has set out to murder him. So he's just an evil person, and he loves it. He just has, as Nietzsche would say, a thrill for the knife. Is
this why he is portrayed as a hunchback, though science is debating whether or not he was?
Oh, no, we know he is. He was found in the park. His bones were found in the parking lot somewhere in London, actually relatively recently. So it turns out that he actually was a hunchback. For years, it was speculative. Yeah, for years they thought, 10 years ago, you would have thought that was just Shakespeare trying to make his body reflect his soul. But it actually turns out that he genuinely was a hunchback, which he actually fixates on. He tells us at some point in the play that his ugliness liberated him from the illusions of love so that he could just take advantage and exploit people who love each other, who want to form a unity or some kind of community of love. And his ugliness actually plays a role in that play. He's not even resentful. He just thinks that he was presented misshapen precisely so that he can be liberated from the illusions of those around him so that he could exploit their weakness.
Don't go anywhere. Khalil Habib is coming right back. Now he's got an answer. Was Richard III made for Machiavelli? Don't go anywhere, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt.
Hello, this is Jeremiah Regan, and I have some great news. We've brought Hillsdale's incredibly popular free online courses to the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. The Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast brings you our online courses in their entirety, with courses ranging from ancient history and biblical epics to foundational political principles and the future of American citizenship. Follow the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast to hear new episodes every week with additional commentary and insights from our team. Go to podcast.hillsdale.edu to learn more. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. During the break, I looked up the fact that Machiavelli was born in 1469 and Richard III is, I think, 1452. So they're contemporaries. Khalil Habib. Professor Habib, what do you think? Is he Machiavelli? Is he come to reign in England?
He does. And I will say one other thing that's funny about their contemporaries. In Talbot, in a previous plays, who lived way before Machiavelli was even born, accuses somebody on the French side of being Machiavellian, which obviously is an enactment, right? And the point there is, I think Machiavelli puts that in there, knowing it's ahistorical, to indicate what he wants us to, another element of what he wants us to get out of these plays, and that is, I think, a dialogue that he's having with Machiavelli. I do believe there's a critique of Machiavelli, though, in these plays. Richard is presented in some ways as extraordinary and impressive. He does. You're just struck at how effective he is. I mean, he woos the wife of somebody he had killed. He's willing. He's very resolute. He's courageous. But there is, I believe, a critique. I don't want to blather on, so cut me off at any time.
No, blather. I'm fascinated.
Well, sure. So, anyone familiar with Machiavelli knows that Machiavelli raises the question of whether it's better to be feared or loved.
Yes.
And of course, Machiavelli says it's better to be feared because love depends on others and fear depends on you. Well, Richard tries to actually rely on fear, and it's mostly effective. But Shakespeare introduces a character, Richmond, who actually is so beloved because of his commitment to justice and to England and to Christianity. They pray the rosary during these plays, and people are willing to actually risk their life to side with justice. And so you can see one of the pillars of Machiavelli's political thought in action, and it actually ends up harming Richard III. He has defectors who, at some point, because the pull to justice is always stronger than fear, he actually starts losing his men one by one. The other critique is that he does have a vision. He has a dream, and all of the men that he had murdered visit him in a dream. And we know it's a dream and not his imagination, because Richmond receives the same visitors in his dream, and they give him an approval, a mandate to follow through with justice because Richard is, in fact, a tyrant. And so Shakespeare wouldn't present that. It wouldn't present Richard's downfall as the result of disrupting the moral and the religious order. He was fated to die. And the women in the play invoke curses from both the Old and the New Testament, and all of their curses come true. And so Shakespeare shows you that no matter how impressive somebody can be, no matter how Machiavellian they can be, at the end of the day, Machiavellian principles leave you alone and isolated and unpolitical, because politics requires compromise and partnership and friendship. And so it begins with a soliloquy and it ends with him dying like a dog in battle. And I think it's very appropriate.
Two quick questions. One, how in the world do they get away with Marian adoration in the Rosary in Elizabethan England? And first, let's answer that one. How does that happen?
Yeah, so that's one reason why some people would say that he is in fact sympathetic with Catholicism. That's one thing. Two, these plays are set prior to the Reformation. And so it would be historically accurate to present them as Catholics. And that's a classic example where Catholicism and politics are not only compatible, they were instrumental in overturning this scourge that Shakespeare presents him as having been sent by God to cleanse England of the stain of the Plantagenets, who from the very beginning with King John, were frankly impious and always rubbing up against church authority. And so I think it's just historically accurate. And like I said, he also, in a way, tries to vindicate the rise of the Tudors in these plays. So I think he that probably might moderate any kind of suspicions.
The second question is, since you're connecting it to the founding, Jefferson, of course, calls for revolution. Other people sign on, and we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of our revolution. There's tyricide, there's regicide throughout these plays. Is this something that the Tudors were happy to have bandied about in Elizabethan and Henry's England?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the historical reaction to them, but I will say one other thing. The posing of Richard III is completely consistent with Aquinas' take on that issue on monarchy and elsewhere in his writings. Aquinas, like Jefferson and like Locke, has no problem with dealing with tyranny. The difference is, for Aquinas, it can't just be any Joe off the street. It has to be through the institutions, which ultimately have their authority in God. Think, for example, the Romans, Gospel of St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And so it's the proper people through the proper institutional channels, essentially destroying Richard III and freeing England from tyranny. So that's another completely consistent event that takes place in those plays that are actually praised, and so totally consistent with Aquinas on that score. Whether the Tudors felt unnerved by that, I'm not sure. That's a good question. I'm not sure about that. They might have, but so, I would be.
When you just finished reading Richard III, what's ringing in your head?
I think although people like, you said it yourself at the very beginning, everybody likes somebody who is bad. They just draw your attention.
Yes.
There's something seductive about him. And as seductive as he does make Richard III, and he does show you at the end of the day, human beings do live in a moral order, and they do live in a political order. And man cannot live outside of this. You remember Aristotle's line that man is a political animal, and the only thing outside of politics by nature is either a god or a beast. And Richard tries to be a god, but he dies like a beast. It's very Aristotelian. And so these plays, I think, reaffirm the necessity for moral virtue and the necessity for justice, and that men like Richard simply will not get away with it, no matter how impressive they are. And I think the criticism is that Machiavelli is a dead end. He leads you down a very dark path that simply doesn't align with reality as Shakespeare presents it.
Well, we were talking about Harvey Mansfield last week, a teacher of mine, though I never quite understood what he was talking about. But I do remember him often talking about virtu. That's the essence of Machiavelli, is to find a prince with virtu. Don't both Richard III and Henry V have virtu?
They do, but in a different way. First of all, what does Machiavelli mean by that? He always means it as self-reliance. He defines, for example, virtue in the prince as relying on one's own arms, and chance as relying on others. So if you're biblically informed, what Machiavelli basically just said, relying on God, you might as well just be rolling the dice. You should always have virtue and go it alone. Hence, Richard is presented. Now, Henry V is a different animal. I know that there are plenty of readings that present him as Shakespeare's most Machiavellian character. The problem with that is Shakespeare himself makes Richard III explicitly that. I think there's ambiguity about Henry V.
I'm coming right back at a couple more segments with Dr. Habib. Don't go anywhere, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. We're taking a break from Churchill with doing Shakespeare for 2 weeks, last week and this week with Dr. Khalil Habib. Dr. Habib is teaching political theory at Hillsdale and has been for a long time. How many years now, Dr. Habib?
I'm coming to the end of my 7th year, so it'll be 8 years.
8 years fall. Up in poor Dr. Habib, having root for Michigan all those years. But Dr. Habib, it's like Maine, though. If you grew up in Maine, there's not much difference between Michigan and Maine. Tell me a little bit about your students and their reaction to these classes.
They like them a lot, and one of the things that has struck them most, and this is literally, I'm reporting what I'm hearing, there's a lot of evil and flirtation with Satanism, actually, in these plays. Joan is working with the demonic, and there are other characters who literally invoke the devil, and it's a part of their ambition, and they're part of their desire to disrupt the political order. And they're really struck by that because we're so conditioned to thinking of politics in purely secular terms, like who's elected, who's not, which branch of government is derelict, or which one is actually doing its job. And Shakespeare's these specific plays really remind you that where you have that kind of ambition, you will always have temptations that are no different than the temptations you find from the fall. And so they're really struck by that. And I think a lot of them are quite satisfied and happy to see somebody take seriously evil and say it's evil and say that it's diabolical. That they were really surprised by. And I think they've told me personally and in class that they appreciate these plays a lot for that reason. It's the first time they see somebody of the magnitude of Shakespeare presenting politics with that lens of looking at the world in terms of good and evil.
Well, you raised the penultimate question. I'll save the last one for the last segment. When you confront Shakespeare, is it possible he did it all by himself? It's such an extraordinary achievement.
Yeah, I would like to think so. They're just so coherent, and they just are so masterful. Just the way forget all his other plays, just the way the English history plays lined up. They have to, if you read the Summa, you would think that was done it couldn't have been done by one man. It is, I don't know. My experience on committees makes me doubt that more than one person could have produced something that coherent. But I would like to think that he wrote them himself. They're just too interconnected.
So have you done other Shakespeare courses, and do you plan to do more, or is it just the three Henry plays and Montesquieu?
No. I've been teaching Shakespeare for a long time. I would say close to 2 decades. I've taught Titus Andronicus. I've taught the Roman plays. I've taught Macbeth. I've done reading groups on Shakespeare, and this is, I think, the second or third time that I've taught Shakespeare at Hillsdale, and the students asked me if we could continue on into the summer, into next year. So there seems to be quite a demand for it.
You disappointed me earlier, Professor, when you said that Caesar was a old senile brute. I love the play. I've seen it perform more than any other Shakespeare, and I've never heard that before. So I'm sort of taken aback. I read a lot of Plutarch as well. Dr. Arnn and I did many weeks on Plutarch. To what do you attribute that?
I think Shakespeare is a closet Republican, and I didn't know this. I didn't catch it until I teach Julius Caesar actually every summer. Come to think of it, for Hillsdale College, we have a teachers conference in the summer, and for years I just took for granted Shakespeare's presentation of Julius Caesar. The play is named after him, and yet the first time we see him, he's hard of hearing. He misjudges people. He looks frail, and he just looks out of touch. But then I went and I decided, you know what, I should probably read Caesar. I mean, if I'm really going to teach this play. And I was struck by how incredible Julius Caesar himself is. I read the Gaelic Wars cover to cover, and I thought, wow, what a discrepancy between Julius Caesar himself and what he's written and the way Shakespeare presents him. And the only thing I can attribute that to is that Shakespeare presents Coriolanus sympathetically, even though, it is a tragedy, but he's a Republican through and through. He's a true aristocrat.
Oh, interesting.
You can say,
old
man. And then
do you read Plutarch?
I've only read the Plutarch on Antony and I believe Julius Caesar.
Well,
and one of the Gracchi brothers.
Read Sulla as well, but Sulla said about Caesar when he had wanted to proscribe him and he was talked out of it, anyone who doesn't see that there are many Mariuses in Caesar is blind. I'm paraphrasing, but right. Sulla had measured the man instantly. I'm going to come back and we're going to wrap up with Montesquieu because I think I owe it to the audience. We mentioned him in passing. We were assuming facts not in evidence that you have any idea who Montesquieu is. Not a French restaurant in Georgetown, so we'll tell you about it when we come back. Don't go anywhere. I'm Hugh Hewitt.
Hey there. Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back, America. It's my last segment for a while with Dr. Khalil Habib, who is a professor of political theory at Hillsdale. He also teaches con law. He also teaches medieval theology, politics, and literature. But originally, we were going to cover a little bit of Montesquieu. It is our 250th birthday, and Montesquieu plays an enormous role in the framing, whether or not you know that, at least in the Constitution. Dr. Habib, explain a little bit about Montesquieu, who he is, why he matters, what he's up to.
So he published a work called The Spirit of the Laws. It came out in 1748. And he is the second most quoted authority among the American founders. Some say Locke, some say Montesquieu. It's a photo finish. If he wasn't second, then he was third. The first, of course, was the Bible. And the American founders drew our separation of powers from Montesquieu and not from Locke. There isn't an independent judiciary in Locke like there is in Montesquieu. And so they really favored Montesquieu's approach to that. And secondly, he's the only philosopher actually mentioned by name in the Federalist Papers. Polybius is mentioned, but Polybius is generally taken to be a political historian or political theorist / historian. But Montesquieu was enormously important. And they take Montesquieu's path to solving the problem of factions, and that is in 9 and 10 of the Federalist Papers. They say the way to deal with them is not to deprive human beings of the right to associate, and it's not to deprive them of the right to freedom of speech. We know that that kind of liberty is likely to generate factions that the English history plays show you can lead to complete destruction of a political order. So what do? Well, building on David Hume and Montesquieu, they decide to go and adopt what they call a confederated republic, which is to say a large country made up of various states that are incorporated into this extended sphere, where the federal government would be something like a monarchical power that can be large enough and central enough that it can prevent foreign threats or at least reduce them. And the separation of powers internally would curb the potential for that to ever become tyrannical, and that the states could remain republic in the sense that they're small, they're where there can be local participation. And so they adopt that as a way of expanding the orbit of the territory and government so that you can have freedom of speech, you can have all this liberty without having the effects of factions bringing the country down. And I would say they've been remarkably successful. We've only had one civil war. We have a very robust freedom of speech and freedom to associate. In England, that led to civil war. In Lebanon, that leads to civil war. In Athens, in ancient Athens, the smallness, or how Madison puts it, the petty republics of the ancients, meant they were so small that they were always swinging from anarchy to tyranny and anarchy to tyranny. They were just unstable. So Montesquieu is very important for the American founders.
And I want people to, he was born in 1689. He's a French judge. He dies in 1755. So he is to the framers, at least of the Constitution, as Reagan would be to us. So he's not so far removed from the framers that they would not be immediately familiar with his work. And of course, Dr. Habib and I are taping this, and we're doing so on February 20th, the day that the United States Supreme Court strikes down Donald Trump's tariff powers, which is the perfect example of a separation of powers, checking one branch, checking another in a way that upsets the former but doesn't endanger the latter. So it's worked.
Yeah. No, it's astonishing. I mean, what's interesting about Montesquieu and why this works is he felt that if you properly channel, when he looks at the English, for example, he says there's a general unease about the English that I'm observing, Montesquieu says. And that unease is that their adversaries, their opposing factions or parties, have access to power, but they do too. And what Montesquieu says is that the secret, the trick to the separation of powers is that everybody has enough butterflies in their stomach and concern that the other side could make advancements and they can't, that it actually creates an institutional equilibrium that doesn't result in bloody conflict and civil war. So believe it or not, this kind of anxiety that Americans generally feel around elections and midterms and what happens when a president gets into power, who ends up on the court, is actually not a bug. It's a feature of the separation of powers, because Montesquieu thought your liberty is destroyed the moment you become complacent. And what the separation of powers does is it gives the illusion, and he even uses that term, that at any moment you could lose the liberty that you have. He says, as long as people continue to believe that, they'll remain politically active and avert the problem that luxury and complacency can create, which is really the condition that leads to centralization of authority and tyranny. So vigilance requires that constant potential risk that you could lose your liberty. So it's a very fine edge that Montesquieu walks. So
I want to conclude this way. In your note to me, you said these are Churchill's favorite plays, the history plays. Was it just Henry VI or Henry VI and Richard III, or all of the history plays?
I think the English history plays. When I used to take students to Oxford, when I taught study abroad ages ago, we would go, for example, to Blenheim, and depending on who you would get for a tour guide, they would tell you that Churchill would show up whenever an English history play was being performed, and people would report that he would actually mouth all of the lines sitting there as the actors were acting, and quite often we'd go back into the dressing room afterward and critique them or praise them. Huh. He loved the English history plays, and and as you know, Churchill himself wrote a history of the English-speaking peoples.
Oh yes,
and I think he was absolutely educated and formed by Shakespeare. I have no doubt about that.
If I have a favorite line in the history of the English-speaking peoples, it's when he writes about Joan of Arc. If she did not exist, she ought to have. And so I like the way he approaches history. He's very, very generous.
Right.
Dr. Habib, thank you for all your generous amount of time. Next time we talk, who knows where we'll be, wherever your classes take you. I'm glad that you were up there at Hillsdale. Remember, have you, by the way, taught a video course yet?
No, we're actually in the process. We've got one coming up. I think we're filming in May.
What's it going to be about?
And it's going to be on Montesquieu.
Ah, very good.
So
we will look forward to that, and we'll promote the heck out of it. Yeah. Dr. Khalil Habib, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.